So we're going over a concept boundary here, and as you know from having done this with me before, they're just almost arbitrary. They give me a sense of where I'm going, but they're not, hard, fast. They overlap a little bit. I mean, is there really a difference in implementing the technologies and the social implications of having implemented them? Well, yeah, sort of, but it's not a real hard, fast boundary. This section does talk a little bit about some stuff that has to do with how people get along and what the new media might have to do with that. So, the first one has to do with this notion that there are some really significant differences in our social environment. And I'll highlight some aspects of this without, again, going through it to the point that you want to put your pencil through your head via your ears. The first part, I suppose, is to note where Death of Distance comes from. This is a book. It's cited at the bottom of this concept. Francis Carencross is a principal economic writer for the New York Times. Also writes for the Washington Post sometimes and other important newspapers. But Carencross is the economics writer. So The Death of Distance, which is a book which made some proposals about 8 years ago about what would happen to economies given the web. Focuses on economic outcomes. So everything you see here looks social and kind of is, but it really relates most directly to the social impacts of the economic outcomes. Okay? In other words, he didn't do sociological work in order to come up with these ideas. He did economic work, looked at what would happen with money and its distribution based on the coming of the internet. And it's 8 years old. I'd have to actually Google it to see. I'll look it up later, but you can look it up. I think it's 8 years, might be 10 years even. So it wasn't at the beginning of the internet, but not too long after the beginning, right? So he's sort of proposing what's going to happen. Some of this has happened right as he thought it might, and some of it's not quite played out exactly as he thought. Okay, still pretty close. Still pretty close. But I think at some point, probably a book like that, you got to go back and redo it, and say, okay, so here's what I said, and here's what happened. And he hasn't written that second book yet. World was flat. Friedman turned around and wrote one in about 3 years. Wow. But part of it was, you sell enough of them, you want to write another one so you can sell some more. Anyway, essentially what Carencross proposed, and this was the first kind of major theorist to sort of say this, is that in terms of the economy, things would change pretty dramatically based on the internet, right? That doing business would really change. Now, I guess I want to say one thing about that before I kind of get to it. When you go on the web, right, to wherever you go, remember that you're on what we call the commodity internet. Okay? I think since AOL quit doing what they were doing when they started, it's pretty much seemed to everybody like they're on the same web. When AOL was in place, you were on AOL's walled garden, and then you would go outside of it and be on the internet. But since AOL quit doing that, now we all feel like we're all on the internet. We're all on the commodity internet. Business to business uses the same pipes in different ways. And there's actually more traffic, business to business, on the not commodity internet using internet pipes than there is public on the internet. You got to remember that. We think of the internet as one thing, but it's not. It's a bunch of pipes that get used in a bunch of different ways. And in some ways, this analysis is a little more important than things you can say about the World Wide Web in some ways, okay? Because it's how the money moves. Okay? So, the banking industry does almost as many transactions, if you were to take them all as single hits on web pages. The banking industry alone does almost as many transactions a day as does everybody else who's on the commodity internet. Because, of course, every time they transfer any kinds of funds for any kinds of payment over the internet, which is how the banking industry works now, it would count, right? So it's a lot bigger segment, bless you, it's a lot bigger segment than, who's reading the New York Times or who's going to YouTube or who's, because these guys are using this stuff 24/7 globally to move all the money in the world. All right, so horizontal bonds, language, culture, job will be strengthened across different parts of the globe. Another way of labeling that would be to say there'll be a lot of outsourcing, which is what Friedman comes along and says here in just a minute. Okay, horizontal bonds. We send out a lot of stuff that previously we kept local. A lot of work, a lot of money, and we send it more broadly across the globe. Okay, and that tends to connect us to folks, connect folks to each other in ways that they weren't connected before. It tends to spread the income a little bit, which we'll get to in just a second. But it certainly connects us, right, with folks that we weren't connected with before at all, and makes kind of commonalities out of it. So, you don't want to overstate this because it's in economic terms, but take China out of the equation because they're not really in the internet yet altogether. Right? Take China out of the equation. The language of the internet is English. Now, do other people? Are there web pages in other languages? Yeah, but take China out of the equation. English is the lingua franca of the internet. Now, when this first started, right, there was still a really broad educational way of thinking, cultural way of thinking, said everybody's got to learn a second language because this is going to be a global environment. You're really going to be in trouble if you haven't learned a second. Everybody's going to have to learn a second language. That is not to say that we don't still believe that a second language is useful for lots of good reasons. Okay, learning a second language causes you to see the world a different way, think about things differently, process the world a little different, and gives you a different point of view, and you might get connected to somebody that you're going to have to do business with a lot, so learning that second language is really good. But we used to say that it was absolutely crucial because you're not going to be able to do business with the world without it. Baloney. Everybody speaks English on the internet. Not everybody, but it's so much more broadly distributed now that it changed that. Right? Change that feature. Business is done on the internet in English. Strengthen those horizontal bonds. Okay. Still good to learn a second language, by the way, for lots of good reasons. Vertical bonds would be weakened. That's the control feature. As you get people involved, you give them access, that one-to-many control feature starts to lessen a little bit. Right? So you get the possibility of more protest, more integration, more cultural variety. You get the possibility of seeing things from different points of view, extended from the way it was before when everybody was sort of siloed and you only had television pictures. I can actually talk with people in various places. Okay? When I can do that, it loosens a little bit the degree to which people can control me. A general principle taken from McLuhan, bless you, familiarity may or may not breed love, but it will drive knowledge of others. He picked that just absolutely whole cloth right out of McLuhan's ideas about the global village. Theoretical idea, best as we can tell, probably kind of true. We know it from social science studies about racism, for example, and race relations. Increased exposure to others doesn't necessarily break down stereotypes and cause positive feelings. In fact, more exposure might raise those sometimes, make it worse. However, positive outcomes, especially in initial encounters with others, usually raises liking and lower stereotypes. So there's no guarantee that because we're hooked up, we're more familiar with each other, we have more knowledge of each other, we're going to like each other anymore. there are certainly people groups that the internet has given us more access to about which we care almost even less, having known more about them. But we are more familiar with them. Our system, we don't misunderstand the system quite as much. So that doesn't mean we're going to like it. Okay. And again, that's a concept he has sort of lifted whole cloth from the cooler. Income distribution across countries will narrow, but within countries will widen. Now, this is starting to be kind of economic analysis, and the sort of issues that get raised here have to be held in abeyance a little bit because of this damned recession thing. You have a global international financial crisis. Sort of all bets are off about what you say about the economy. Had things kind of gone on without the big dip, he'd have been pretty close. Okay? Because what has happened is that in this country, for example, the income distribution between rich and poor has widened, bigger gap, and there's also more even distribution across the global economy in general. But the figures get all woo because of the financial crisis. It's hard to track it through the last 3.5 years or so because there's just so much chaos in the economies that you can't blame the internet. Good Lord, we're having a global financial crisis. Okay. So while he's not wrong, it's a little bit hard to pull evidence today that shows this exactly. The idea is that because of outsourcing and the ability for people to do work all over the globe, that income is going to be distributed more widely to places that couldn't make very much before. And that has happened. And when you do that, you're taking a little bit off the top, right? So nationally, things dip a little bit. Right? When things dip a little bit, the guys in charge get a little bit more than the guys who aren't. Pretty straightforward sort of way of thinking about it. But again, the crisis has sort of put the ability to illustrate that with strict numbers into a little bit of question. Digitizing stuff leaves tracks. We talk about it a little bit in control. We talk about it a little bit today. And the reason I note this one from him is he has a very particular way of looking at this, which I think is useful to bring up. So, commercial use of content lets folks target it. You just can't, there isn't anything that you can do with your money in this environment that isn't tracked, and potentially specifically to you, which is altogether different than pulling a $20 bill out of your pocket, walking up to a merchant, handing it to him, taking the goods away, and walking away. Unless you're on camera for that, right, doesn't leave tracks. But as soon as you whip out that debit card, as soon as you make the purchase on your cell phone, as soon as you use a computer to buy the online piece, whatever it is, then not only theoretically, but practically, that purchase and the process you use to get there is trackable. And that has implications. Yeah?
Do people log your purchases? Is
Well,
that credit card company? Is it like...
Well, of course people log your purchases.
Well, like,
Yes.
sometimes if your credit card's stolen and somebody pays for like a candy bar with it, the credit card company will call you and be like, hey, did you...
Right.
Is that how they get it?
Trust me, the short answer is yes. Yeah. Electronic money moves and not everybody, but way more people, way larger number of people than you could ever imagine knows about what you do. And this is the environment we're in new media. Make a phone call. Way more people potentially could know about where you are and what you're doing than ever could have if you were on a landline. It's just the way it is. Now, how much should we worry about that? And that's why I include this portion here. Because Karen Cross has a particular way of thinking about it, which I think has to be at least given some space. I don't know whether or not it's right, but it has to be at least kind of aired, right? And that's that his proposal is there's so much information you needn't worry about it much at all. Now, clearly there are privacy advocates who worry about it a lot. That every time you make a transaction, every time you do something, there's a whole bunch of people who could know. Right? But Karen Cross says, look, think about it for just a minute. Yeah, okay. Your web, and this was even before cookies, but I'm going to extend it at this point. If we were to apply this to what he wrote, one would say, yeah, virtually every keystroke when you're on the web is tracked. Because somebody's collecting all that information with cookies, they know where you've been, they know the next guy knows where you've been, then they see what you purchased, then there's your credit card, and, and theoretically you're not anonymous, and we can connect it all up. Now multiply that by just everybody in this room today. And the numbers are just exponential. I mean, there's so much information generated. His point is, there probably isn't anybody who could even aggregate it if they wanted to. Now, there are lots of aggregation services that buy and sell lots of information that do aggregate pieces of it, right? But it's still pretty demographic stuff. It's not what Dan did today. Could it be? Sure. It could. But who's got the... I mean, come on, folks. New York City in 2000 turned in 56% of their census forms. This year they're at 37% so far. We can't even take the census from everybody. We can't even count them all. And that's just one narrow activity. Who are you, where do you live, and how many people in the household? And you're talking about being worried about tracking everything that you do with digital. You produce so much data, nobody could marshal all that data. That's his point. There's just so much. Not that there isn't a privacy concern or set of privacy concerns, but that the kind of thinking that says, oh my goodness, they're just tracking us and surveying us and surveilling us and controlling us by the data that they collect on us is just, from his point of view, absurd because it would be so hard to marshal it all. So we don't know there's 7 or 8 guys in the country on bad visas that have expired doing flight training on 747s in Florida and Arizona fast enough that the feds can stop them from flying those things into buildings. Over the course of 3 or 4 years altogether. And you're worried about, the tracks you leave when you do a visa transaction, for God's sakes? Come on. Yeah.
As for right now, aren't there any laws that prohibit, give you privacy when you're on your computer? Right?
Yeah. We don't have time. Yes. The question is, aren't there laws? And the answer is yes. But to not have you take 450, which I'm teaching, which is on privacy, they're not good enough, and they don't cover enough. And it's a pretty confusing state of affairs as to what maybe they should. It's really hard. So let me try to answer your question specifically. The laws that cover us the best, and there are some, are laws which limit the information the federal government can collect on citizens and what they do with the information. Now, the federal government still collects an enormous amount of information, but within some constraints. Okay? And there are some other constraints about what they can do with that information. And if they misuse the information, in theory, the agency's supposed to get in trouble, and you're not supposed to get in trouble, in theory. But it's a pretty big mess. There's very little law that constrains the private sector. So, there's some law that constrains the government. It's way behind the times. It's like IP law. It hasn't caught up at all, and you don't know. So what are those laws? You don't know. And you're not an exception. Nobody knows. And unless you study it, right? And do those laws work efficiently? Some folks would say they work kind of okay. Other folks would say hardly at all. And new media has really raised the stakes for that. Let me give you an example. The Privacy Act says that agencies in the federal government can't share information across databases. Right? So Social Security collects information on you, which they do with your Social Security number to pay out when you retire. They can't exchange that with Health and Human Services. Health and Human Services has health information on you. They can't exchange that information with Social Security. Okay? There's a law that says they have to. Well, that was the problem with 9/11. We were agencies who collected information and they couldn't exchange information with each other. Immigration couldn't exchange information with the FBI, so they couldn't connect the dots. So with new media, the government really would like to kind of cross those boundaries that the Privacy Act would like them not to cross. So part of what the Patriot Act did was allow them a little semi-permeability, which they didn't have before. Now, is that good or bad? Well, let's see. It's bad because the privacy guys put that stuff in to protect your privacy. Wait, it's good because the security guys need to keep people from blowing your subway up. And none of it relates to the private sector. Our problem in the private sector is there's laws that do regulate somewhat, a little bit, what can be collected about you, not enough, but they don't apply to anybody who's a third party. So, for example, I'm trying to be specific but fast. There is a sort of way of thinking which says once you give a third party the information, it's no longer private. If you keep it to yourself, someone intrudes on your seclusion, they can be sued for privacy invasion. But once you give it up, then it's not private anymore. So, for example, when you register for a cell phone, there are courts that have said in cases that are allied with this, that then once you start using it, you've said none of it's private. Because you've contracted with a third party to be the middle person between you and the conversation with someone else. You want to have a private conversation with someone else, you do it in your bedroom. You do it at home. Don't get on a cell phone and do it. You've given that information out. So then the cell phone company can sell that information to anybody they want. Where you were, how many calls you made, what kind of stuff you look for on your cell phone, da-da-da-da-da-da. The law doesn't cover that third-party information very well. It doesn't actually cover the information that people collect on it from the private sector very well.